Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise at second reading debate on Bill 82.
Here's the order right here, Sharon.
Of course, at second reading debate, there's supposed to be a debate of ideas, Mr. Speaker, a debate of ideas among members in this House, but if members aren't going to participate from the government side, it's not much of a debate, Mr. Speaker, so I hope we'll see more members on the government side get up and speak to Bill 82. Mr. Speaker, Bill 82 was designed to entrench the principle of universal elected municipal self-governments throughout the province, everywhere. But, Madam Speaker, it's fallen short. It's fallen short, Madam Speaker, because it creates, in Part 15, these rural districts into which a lot of small rural communities have been dumped, Madam Speaker. 61,000 New Brunswickers, in fact, living in small rural communities have been dumped into these rural districts. And they're really just supersized LSDs. They have all of the problems of the LSD system, no greater authority, and yet much more removed from the people that are supposed to be represented, Madam Speaker, in these super LSDs. It didn't need to be this way, and it doesn't need to be this way, Madam Speaker. Sure, maybe that some of these communities, there's harder work to be done to bring them to the point where they come up with reasonable proposals for incorporating their rural community with their in a way that's going to be sustainable, Madam Speaker. But that's the hard work that remains to be done, because you can't say, Madam Speaker, the minister can't say he's brought local democracy to New Brunswick when he's left 61,000 New Brunswickers out. There's nothing in these rural districts that's very democratic. Same critique that he and others have brought to the LSD system, Madam Speaker, which I agree with that critique. He's just entrenched with these super LSDs called rural districts, 12 of them. You've got such disparate rural communities dumped into them with little in common. I think of the islands immediately come to mind. Miscou and Whitehead, so Miscou in the northeast, Whitehead in the southwest, both small inhabited islands that, of course, for those who are year-round, and those islands have been dumped into the super LSDs of their adjacent mainlands, and they're not that close to the mainland in either case at all, Madam Speaker. Whitehead is 2 ferry rides away, and Miscou, of course, is on the other side of another island, Limerick. So, Madam Speaker, that doesn't make any sense to me. There's got to be, it's almost like it's a convenience that some of these communities, for whatever reason, the government couldn't get to play ball, or they perceived they weren't interested in playing ball to create local self-governing municipalities. And so they got put into limbo or purgatory, Madam Speaker. And that's just not acceptable. More work needs to be done, Madam Speaker, to ensure that actually everyone has access to local governance, to be part of a local democratic community, locally run democratic community, Madam Speaker, and this doesn't do it. I don't see how we can just write off 61,000 New Brunswickers and say, well, sorry, you're not part of this reform. You're not part of this reform. I mean, the overall reform, Madam Speaker, sure, the rest of it, there are issues here and there, but those can be resolved around boundaries and various things through discussion and consultation. But, Madam Speaker, these rural districts, these super LSDs, just retrench what we've had, only worse, because because you're throwing in such disparate communities into these super LSDs, these rural districts, Madam Speaker. So that needs to be addressed, and urgently. If this bill, the government had done the obvious and correct thing, which would have been to refer this bill to the Law Amendments Committee, Madam Speaker, then those communities could have been heard here in the legislature by the committee to entertain their ideas, entertain their concerns, and make proposals about how to move forward to ensure that actually the spirit of this bill, the intent of this bill, the principle of universal elected municipal self-governments applies to everybody. Applies to everybody within their communities, Madam Speaker, without bulldozing their communities. So that, once again, I have the impression that government is just concerned about the Legislative Assembly's work getting in the way of the work of the Executive Council. And that's not acceptable, Madam Speaker, in a democracy. You can't treat the Legislative Assembly that way, though they do. And they're not the first government to do that. We've evolved to a place that is very dark when it comes to our democracy, Madam Speaker, that successive governments regard it simply as voting now, and they can do whatever they want if they have a majority within 4 years. Well, that's not acceptable. That's not democracy. It's not democratic. Democracy is messy. Of course it is, because it involves lots of people with lots of views, different world views, with lots of issues and ideas and concerns and thoughts, Madam Speaker. So, of course, democracy is messy. Autocracy is not. Very straightforward. But when you've got the Executive Council, as has happened with this government and past governments in recent years, acting the way they have, looking at the Legislative Assembly as a rubber stamp, as just a hurdle to get over, something to get through, Madam Speaker, then, you know, you've got an autocracy, really. Slightly slowed down by the going through the motions in the Legislative Assembly. And that's not only sad, but dangerous. We can look, Madam Speaker, a little further and say, if government is committed to, as the Minister describes it, eliminating the democratic deficit, in addition to actually rolling up the sleeves and ensuring that those 61,000 people and the many communities that they belong to are part of that, Madam Speaker, you have to look at how to enfranchise citizens at the same time. Because the muscle of active citizenship, Madam Speaker, has atrophied, really. Has atrophied as people have become alienated by their democratic institutions, become cynical about them, see a huge gulf between their reality and their priorities and what our democratic institutions and governments have been focusing on. So, Madam Speaker, there needs to be work done there. So part of that atrophy, of course, is people have come to believe that the exercise of democracy is simply voting every 4 years. But nothing could be farther from the truth, not in a healthy democracy, Madam Speaker. There needs to be, very practically, a means to provide training and capacity building to new local government officials, to citizens as well. And that's why I have advocated for some time, Madam Speaker, that government support the establishment of a Centre for Local Democracy and Community Governance. A Centre for Local Democracy and Community Governance that could be based at the Memramcook Institute, since government already owns it and it's looking for tenants. An Institute for Local Democracy and Community Governance that, at its core, could be run by a collaboration among our post-secondary education institutions, universities, community colleges, to deliver the kind of training, capacity building that local elected officials need, and even more so will need, and that citizens need to be active citizens within their local democratic realities, Madam Speaker. So how can government say they're moving towards eliminating the democratic deficit when there is no emphasis placed whatsoever on the citizens and the local elected officials who are to come to ensure that in both cases they have the capacity to play their role in those local democracies, Madam Speaker. You know, in a healthy democracy, we would have a deliberative process locally, because you can do it. You're closer to the people. You can have a deliberative process with things like citizens' assemblies, Madam Speaker. Citizens' assemblies which would really enhance the democratic process, that are developed around specific issues of concern for the local community, Madam Speaker. And those citizens' assemblies, it's been shown where they have been tried in other places, Madam Speaker, that it actually strengthens people's connection to public institutions. It helps to start to dig away at that alienation from public institutions and from political processes that has been eating away at our democracy. And if this government were really concerned about eliminating the democratic deficit, we would see the provision for establishing something like this in this bill. But it's not there, Madam Speaker. They have plenty of time to do it. The bill's 127 pages. It wouldn't take too much more space to incorporate the creation of a Center for Local Democracy and Community Governance, Madam Speaker, but it's not there. The other thing that's not there, Madam Speaker, is that much of the rural land base in New Brunswick falls only within these rural districts, which don't have any real authority, Madam Speaker, where the Minister of Local Government remains the mayor. It's about 70 to 80% of the provincial landmass. And you have to ask why. Why is that land base largely outside of the boundaries of new entities, new local governments that are being created by this bill all over New Brunswick? You have to ask that question. And it makes me think, Madam Speaker, of the efforts of one of the first incorporated rural communities in New Brunswick, one of the early ones, and that was Upper Miramichi. Upper Miramichi, after incorporating, they had, I don't know, 10,000 hectares or something, maybe it was acres, within their municipal boundaries of Crown forest land. And Madam Speaker, they had an idea that they could institute a community-based approach to managing that land base. And they were concerned about the types of forest management practices that were going on there. They wanted to see less clear-cutting, more select cutting. They wanted to see greater economic benefits for the local community from the forestry activity there, determined by the community. They wanted to see more diverse uses of the forest, Madam Speaker, within their new municipal boundaries. They wanted to, in a sense, exercise democratic control over what happened on that land, Madam Speaker. And they started to pursue that work. They did research, and they invited others to come in who had some expertise to speak to them about that kind of community-based management. They wanted to exercise their stewardship as a community over the adjacent lands and waters, Madam Speaker. And you know what the government of the day told them when they finally approached the minister responsible, which would have been the Minister of Natural Resources, because it was forestry and Crown land, they told that community to go talk to the Irvings, and if it was okay with the Irvings, it was going to be okay with them. That's what happened. True story. So that was the end, Madam Speaker, of the efforts of Upper Miramichi Rural Community Incorporated Municipality to gain some control and have some say over the adjacent land base. And I guess it's no surprise, Madam Speaker, when First Nations, who haven't even ceded the land, have no control or say at this point in what happens on those lands. So it is, again, concerning that this tremendous opportunity has been lost, which would have enabled local democratic institutions to have ability to determine what happens on the land base adjacent to their communities. Because we've seen constant problems all over the province where the provincial government supports some particular development which doesn't make any sense from a community perspective to be located where it is, for example. And yet, there's no real ability to prevent that from happening. This reform, if its spirit had been carried through in the way I'm describing, that would have provided that possibility. One of the other concerns, Madam Speaker, about the democratic deficit here is it's not clear to me how citizens are going to be able to have a meaningful role in the work of the regional service commissions. Now, some regional service commissions will operate in a way that provides citizens with a meaningful role, and others may not. But there's nothing prescribed in the legislation that ensures that happens. And the minister might say, well, you know, each of the municipalities and even the super LSDs are represented on the Regional Service Commission. But it creates a layer of decision-making, Madam Speaker, which appears to me as being inaccessible to the citizens on whose behalf those decisions are being made. So if we're truly talking about eliminating a democratic deficit and instituting a more grassroots form or participatory form of democracy, then there needs to be some provision for that. And I don't see it in the bill, Madam Speaker. In fact, what I do see in the bill is a reluctance for the provincial government to give up some of its powers. If you're going to make local governments more democratic, ensure they have greater autonomy, Madam Speaker, that means the provincial government is going to have to give up some of the power it currently holds over them. But that doesn't appear to be the case. There are numerous examples in the bill, Madam Speaker, which gives the minister the authority to just bulldoze over what might happen locally. I mean, it begins with how, for example, the executive directors of the regional service commissions are going to be hired, not by the local communities, but by the minister. And it continues. So if you look at, Madam Speaker, if you look at rural planning, the minister is able to essentially establish a rural plan in an area whether or not people agree with it. That certainly would seem to be provided for within the legislation, Madam Speaker. So that's a concern. That's a concern. Also, you know, the bill provides for the ability of 25 people in one of these rural districts, the super LSDs, to petition the minister for particular development to occur in the super LSD somewhere, or to shut something down. And the thing that strikes me in the bill, Madam Speaker, is the threshold for these super LSDs, some of whom have a lot of people in them, is 25 people. 25 people can petition the minister. Now that enables, Madam Speaker, the government to get up all kinds of mischief. 25 people. Any government can mobilize 25 people of their supporters, for example, to do what they want them to do, to bring forward a petition, to line up with the government's agenda. The threshold is way too low. It's open to all kinds of manipulation. I can't understand why the bar would have been set so low. 25 people. 25 people. It just is crying out, Madam Speaker, for an amendment. That's for sure. What lies behind that? I don't know, Madam Speaker, but it's not democratic. It's too low. It's like, you know, some people say there should be recall legislation for politicians. Well, imagine if you set the level of the recall at 25 people. They'd all be out of a job. So therein lies the problem. The bill also speaks to the government's role, well, in creating statements of public interest. Well, it used to be called statements of provincial interest, but this bill changes to public. So people don't get confused that statements of provincial interest aren't a political agenda, but they're in your best interest because they're statements of public interest, and they may be, Madam Speaker, they may be. But the question is, you know, how do these statements of public interest get developed? Do in each case they make sense to be applied uniformly across the province? And I guess that sets the bar for them. If they're going to be applied uniformly across the province, then there needs to be a pretty robust process to come up with a statement of public interest that is province-wide. So this is where I have difficulty. A statement of provincial interest is clearer because it in the label says, okay, there is something so important affecting the common good of everyone in the province that government is going to create a statement of public interest. One can think about action on climate change or action to help protect communities and families from the consequences of the climate crisis. Well, that's a huge province-wide interest, and it's in the public interest for sure. But the process for developing these has to be robust and has to be very careful in the sense that you don't end up with statements of public interest that actually cannot be applied fairly as a one-size-fits-all solution. I believe, Madam Speaker, there are statements of provincial interest that we need, absolutely, that serve the common good of all. But I also believe that the way it currently exists, leaves it open for statements of public interest to be created which don't meet that test. So there should be some clearer and substantive criteria about what defines statements of public interest, including the process by which they're arrived at. If statements of public interest, presumably they should come before the Legislative Assembly right here, because that's what we're elected for, to serve the common good, Madam Speaker. And so when it comes to defining statements of public interest that apply province-wide, that are so important they have to be applied province-wide, Madam Speaker, those should be determined and voted on here in the Legislative Assembly, debated here. That makes not within the department, not within Cabinet, but here in the Legislative Assembly through this democratic process. So, Madam Speaker, I think that amendments are required to kind of remove the hand of the province in those areas where it actually is going to interfere with the ability of local democratically elected governments to exercise their authority. And let's start, Madam Speaker, with enabling local regional service commissions to hire their own executive directors. That's the beginning, right there. That would send a good message. That would send a good message that, in fact, authority is moving to the more local level or to the more regional level from the center. But you can't have it both ways. Well, they're trying to have it both ways. but to be true about this, to really carry through and implement the principle of universal elected municipal self-governments, have real authority, autonomy to help citizens in their municipalities, whatever form they are, to be masters in their own house. In all those areas that are locally appropriate, I don't see that in this bill, Madam Speaker. So, amendments need to be made. People need to be heard from. This is a significant piece of legislation, and it's an important piece of legislation, and it's the first time that we've had this kind of fundamental restructuring table before this House in more than a generation, I would say. You know, in the days of equal opportunity, as my colleague from from Kent North said, that was transformational, and yet amendments were made on the floor of the Legislative Assembly to improve it. Amendments were entertained, were supported, debated and supported to make changes to Louis Robichaud's project, to make it even better. That's the kind of role this Legislative Assembly should be playing, Madam Speaker. And there we were talking about something so fundamental that was going to make such a huge difference in the lives of so many New Brunswickers, in the lives of so many Acadians, the lives of people living in rural areas, in poverty in Charlotte County. Yet, it wasn't rammed through. The Legislative Assembly's authority is respected. Amendments were entertained and were adopted, Madam Speaker. So, we need to see the same kind of engagement here in the Legislative Assembly on this bill, Madam Speaker. It's important, and it's too important to just push it through the Legislative Assembly, the government to use its majority, ignore any amendments that may be proposed at committee stage, and frankly, to avoid subjecting it to law amendments where witnesses could come in and speak to their concerns, improvements they'd like to see. None of that at this point is planned for, Madam Speaker. Instead, we have a time allotment motion, Madam Speaker, which is going to, in the end, shut those possibilities out entirely. It's not democratic. Democracy is coming to the Legislative Assembly, Madam Speaker, but not with this government, perhaps. Going to have to wait, maybe. Going to have to wait.
I will be there.
and I will be there. So, this is not to say, Madam Speaker, that getting this bill before the legislature is not an important thing. It is important. You know, years ago, I think it was under McKenna, maybe, the Commission on Land Use and the Rural Environment did a tremendous job of consultation around the province. I remember being involved as a local citizen in Charlotte County at the time, and came up with a pretty darn good report in the end. The process was good. And, you know, I mean, the greatest amount of consultation on these issues that has been done since was done by this minister, the Minister of Local Government and Local Governance Reform, in this process as well. Not quite as transparent, not quite as inclusive, I would say, of citizens, and like what got called the CLUR, Commission on Land Use and the Rural Environment, CLUR process. But in the end, government didn't have the courage to implement those recommendations back then. So it's good to see this come before this House, because a lot of the reforms that this is addressing need to be made. But there are significant issues within the bill that need to change as well, just as was the case in equal opportunity. The amendments that were made in the equal opportunity debates, Madam Speaker, did not undermine the equal opportunity project. They did not damage it. They did not weaken it. We saw the results. It's history, and its benefits reverberate today. So it's not something to be fearful of, democracy. It's not something to be fearful of to entertain amendments made by opposition members or even by backbenchers. To be truthful, if the legislature was working the way it should, backbenchers on the government side representing the interests of their constituents. That's where we need to get to. And that's where we need to get to with this bill, because it's so important, because it's so significant to the future of the province, and its impact will be felt across generations. No question. Absolutely. So now's the time to address its shortcomings and its weaknesses, not later, now. Yeah, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some time. Governments, as they do, set up their sort of schedule the way they want things to roll out. But as usual, it doesn't anticipate the democratic process it needs to follow, run through the Legislative Assembly here. And so, you know, government after government, when you see this happen, they get all exasperated and say, oh, Legislative Assembly is getting in the way of our agenda, getting in the way of our schedule. Well, democracy necessarily is messy, Madam Speaker, because autocracy is not. Autocracy is clean, efficient in autocratic governments. But we have a democracy, at least we still have a democracy, and we need to improve it. And this bill has measures that will improve local democracies and is lacking in measures that make no difference. So I'll circle back to the rural districts, Madam Speaker, because that really, if it's got an Achilles heel, it's there. If it's got an Achilles heel, it's there. The bill really should lay out a clear process for any of the rural communities that find themselves in the purgatory or limbo of these rural districts. I don't know the difference between the two very well because, well, I'm Protestant, not Catholic, but they seem to both kind of apply in some way. So the bill needs to lay out a way for those communities to get out of there. And there's no clear path to local democracy for those communities, for those, I say 61,000 New Brunswickers, Madam Speaker, but it's not just individuals, but it's the hundreds, 100 or more actual communities that they're part of, Madam Speaker. And everyone knows in rural New Brunswick what community they're part of. It may not be obvious to someone driving by in many cases because our rural communities have been so hollowed out. I lived for a number of decades in Walwick, where we raised our family. People driving through it probably didn't know it was there. If you're on the highway, Route 1, you would, thanks to Denis, former Minister of Transportation, who, after Route 1 was rebuilt, put our sign back up so people could see at least on Route 1 where our community was. But the other communities around us weren't obvious to anyone but us. But we knew where the lines were, essentially. We knew what the community of interest was, and they do. And they do, of course, just like in every rural community. But no one ever asked us about that. We had no LSD committee in our LSD at all. I had a neighbor who showed up hoping to participate in some way at an LSD meeting. It turned out to be the neighboring one because we didn't have one. We had no idea. How do you make that happen? So there needs to be a clear way spelled out in this legislation for these rural communities that comprise in total 61,000 New Brunswickers, whether it's Miscou Island, Whitehead Island, Waterford, Kings County, you name it, to move forward. There's going to have to be compromise for that to happen, Madam Speaker, on both sides. Compromise on the side of the local communities who are currently stuck in the purgatory of regional districts, and compromise on the side of the minister to come up with something that is acceptable and works, Madam Speaker, to carry through the vision of this minister and this bill. And it's a noble principle that he's working with here, of course, to ensure that self-government exists for everyone at the local level across the province, and that they have local autonomy to determine what is in their best interest as communities in a democratic way, Madam Speaker. So I hope, one, that the minister will give more serious thought to seeing this go to Law Amendments Committee, and have a serious discussion with his cabinet colleagues and the Premier about the way they entertain amendments in this House from opposition members, official opposition members, or government backbenchers to improve the Act respecting local governance reform. I think we all agree local governance reform is needed. I haven't heard anyone say no to that. But this is the opportunity now to make sure that it's the best possible local governance reform that can be decided upon and implemented through the process of democratic debate, investigation, amendment, and voting that this Legislative Assembly can offer the people of New Brunswick. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I now